Good morning. We're going to start the meeting. On Tuesday of this week, the board published the proposed restrictive housing rule on our website and distributed it to interested parties via email. The restrictive housing rule package includes certifications from the law department and from the Mayor's Office of Operations. The new proposed rules would establish a comprehensive structure for disciplinary and non-disciplinary housing options that appropriately and in the least restrictive manner necessary respond to gradations of safety risk and/or punishment. As Michelle presented at last week's meeting, the new chapter of rules proposes new limits on time spent in restrictive settings, creation of new categories of people excluded from restrictive settings, expansion of procedural due process protections to all restrictive housing types, including a hearing and a right to appeal, enhanced access to medical and mental health services, and new compliance metrics that will promote public transparency and allow the department, the board, and the public to evaluate the success of restrictive housing policies and programs. Today, the board will vote on whether to formally propose the new chapter of the minimum standards. If the board votes today to propose the rules, the board will publish them in the city record and begin the Citywide Administrative Procedure Act rulemaking process, which is required for any new local rule. CAPA, as it is known, requires a public comment period of at least 30 days, as well as a public hearing. The public hearing is scheduled for December 2nd, 2019. During the public comment period, there will be opportunity to make further amendments as necessary. After the public comment period, the board will publish a final rule on its website and schedule a vote on whether to approve a final rule. After a vote to approve the final rule and its publication in the city record, the rule would go into effect 30 days later. In the proposed rule package, we had announced the public comment period would end on December 2nd, 2019. We've received public input over the last few days that more time for public comment is warranted for this comprehensive rule and have decided to extend the public comment period until January 3rd, 2020. I hope that the board will vote today to formally propose the rule and enter the CAPA public comment period. Thank yous are owed to many for helping us to reach the point that we've reached today. And I wanted to just give a couple of specific thank yous to folks who have made it possible to reach the point that we've reached. First and foremost, to current and former board staff who over the last 3 years have worked tirelessly to gather information, research, facts, speak with folks from around the city and around the country, and engage with our partners in government around these very challenging issues. Also to current and former board members who have given so much of their time and experience to input on these rules, to discussing them through the rulemaking committee and outside of the rulemaking committee as well. You've been exceptionally generous with your time and with your experience in helping us to formulate the best rule possible. Also to staff of the Department of Correction, CHS, the Mayor's Office, and the Law Department for your thoughtful engagement and willingness to discuss these challenging issues as we work towards introducing the rule. Further, to all experts, advocates, people who have been part of the fact-finding and information-gathering phase of this rulemaking. Thank you for sharing research, data, ideas, experiences with us as we have worked to develop this rule. We look forward to much more comment over the next couple of months as we move through the formal rulemaking period, and thank you for your input to date. We are very pleased to begin the formal comment period. Before we begin public comment, I would like to make a short statement on separation status. If DOC identifies contraband on a body scan, in other words, a positive scan, or a person refuses a body scan, DOC places the person into separation status. The department has kept people in separation status until they receive a negative body scan or post bail and are released from custody. Separation status involves 24-hour lock-in, except for the offer of a daily shower. The department submitted and then withdrew a variance request prior to the September 2019 meeting, and the department then submitted a new variance request prior to last week's meeting. The department requested variances from a range of minimum standards, including visiting, recreation, access to court, and access to reading material. After public discussion between board members, we decided to table the variance request pending reconsideration and further discussion whether current operations of separation status are the least restrictive means necessary to accomplish the shared goal of safety for staff and people in custody. The board intends to consider the variance request at our next public meeting on November 12, 2019. Notwithstanding discussions over the past week, neither the board nor the department is yet able to present a new blueprint for the operation of the unit. We will work diligently over the next several days between now and the November meeting to develop a proposal for board consideration at the November public meeting. And now we will move to hear public comment on the restrictive housing proposed rule. First, I will call Danielle Gerard. Good morning.
Chair, board members. We look forward to beginning the public comment on the restrictive housing rules and appreciate the opportunity to mention a few things today. We will do a more thorough analysis during the public comment period. A few things. It seemed, first of all, thank you for extending the public comment period. That was going to be one of my remarks this morning. We were heartened to shed the light of day on the rulemaking process and are looking forward to this. Just a few points. We feel that, unfortunately, some of the rules codify variances that we have spoken out against many times on behalf of children's rights, and we remain concerned regarding continued commingling, which and its concomitant limitations on access to age-appropriate programming, educational opportunities, and more, as specified in our repeated testimony on this issue. We also remain concerned regarding the continued use of restraint desks where young adults are shackled to the desks during lockout time. We are also concerned about the continuing use of ESH for young adults, and we are concerned about the overall absence of a commitment to the young adult plan. We are happy to see that 68% of young adults are housed in exclusive young adult housing, but that leaves a couple hundred young adults without access to the programming that we have emphasized. Finally, we are particularly concerned about daily lockout for young adults in restrictive housing being increased from 7 to 10 hours when it really ought to be 14 hours. And young adults should not be in restrictive housing anyway. We urge you to reinforce your commitment to the young adult plan and everything that it involved when it was first considered back in 2016. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you. Kayla Simpson.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Kayla Simpson. I'm a staff attorney at the Prisoners' Rights Project at the Legal Aid Society. Thank you for calling this special meeting, and thank you for publishing the proposed rules. And we hope formally initiating the public discussion about the rules and their substance today. And of course, we haven't had much time with the rules, and we need to carefully digest what's been left after the scalpel has been taken to them by the city before providing real feedback. But we do look forward to engaging with you, and we appreciate the opportunity. As an initial observation, we are very disappointed to see a set of proposed regulations in New York City in 2019 in the midst of what's touted as a historic reform movement in the way the city treats people in custody. That includes restraint desks and stays in solitary confinement that still violate international standards. Restraint desks, again, are shackles. The proposed rules would end the quote-unquote routine use of shackles by 2022, but still permit, quote, individualized shackles. So we won't use these punitive, dehumanizing restraints as a matter of course, but just whenever we single someone out for them. We think that's unacceptable. It's not just about how physically intolerable it is, of course, to be chained to furniture. We think it's also worth pointing out that it's about what it does psychologically to the people to whom those shackles are applied. And I think it's worth mentioning and worth taking a moment to remember that what we're talking about is shackling young men of color. It bears repeating again and again that these rules are not a 15-day limit on solitary confinement. Instead, they permit punitive segregation for 60 days, or 4 times that limit, which is 4 times what's allowed by international standards about solitary confinement. I'm sure you'll hear the Mandela rules invoked again and again in this process. But I do want to say we appreciate the function-driven definition of restrictive housing that opens the section on restrictive housing. We think it's critical. And covering all housing that looks like isolation regardless of its name is the common sense purpose articulated by your membership in 2016 for this rulemaking process to begin with. But likewise critical to a comprehensive rule is that it contain guidance and regulations limiting that same scope of housing. And we're concerned that the rule as written does not demonstrate guidance for all of those forms. And we sent you a letter yesterday about the practice of solo housing as sort of a case study and the example of the gaps in these rules. And we look forward to helping point out some of the additional gaps, but we would like to see substantive guidance for all of the rules covered by the common sense definition that you have submitted. And finally, I will just say that it looks a lot in these rules like these provisions were meant to not stray too far from the status quo. But a city embracing reform and how it treats people in custody cannot use implements of torture like shackles, cannot use solitary confinement in violation of international standards for political expediency, nor can it permit the continuation of dungeon-esque conditions like separation status, just because what we have to read between the lines is that the department cannot envision modern ways to manage security risks as the very grim Nunez monitors report that was filed on Monday demonstrates. We have to do better, and let's start with abolishing separation status and promulgating a truly comprehensive rule about how the city uses isolation and custody. Thank you. We look forward to continuing to talk.
Thank you. Rashawn Brown. Good morning.
Good day. My name is Rashawn Brown. I am the program manager for Gangsters Making Astronomical Community Changes, a 501c3 nonprofit grassroots organization contracted by the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice to denounce gun violence and tackle social justice issues. I didn't plan on being here today, but I received a letter from someone who is currently on trial. He has a new trial. I received this letter from his mother, and I found out about this meeting today, so I'm going to read the letter from David Marrero, who's currently being held in NYC on Rikers Island. I am being denied access to law library while I'm currently on trial, due process. This is a court going above and beyond and abusing their power I want a copy of all the court restrictions. My court order is depriving me of my human rights and minimum standards. Why am I on a court-ordered lockdown? If it's for drugs on the phone, what does that have to do with my rec, commissary law library, hygiene products, and visits? My due process is being violated. I am searched 4 times a day with a camera in my cell, and anywhere I go, it's a camera, a captain, and 2 officers. When I'm not moving and I am in my cell, there's 2 officers sitting in front of my cell, along with a camera in my cell. There's no other such court order that exists such like this one. You have terrorists, kingpins, murderers who have court order lockdowns, and still their sanctions is nowhere near as severe as mine. Okay. So now, this is the second part of the letter. The officers are making smart remarks saying they have pictures of me naked and changing my clothes. If you remember, they posted a Facebook picture of me when he got cut across his face. No one in any jail in the world has a camera in their cell. Can you please explain why my privacy is being invaded and I'm being being exposed, and soon as I cover it, will come out on a search? Okay. I'm even being deprived of my 1-hour rec, which is mandatory. I would like to speak to the Board of Corrections and prisoners' rights about my due process being violated. And this is from David Marrero, who's currently being held in NYC. I myself was once held in solitary confinement for a period of up to 18 months, and I was denied food, I was denied basic necessities, you know, and that was because it was a lot of foul practices going on. So we must please end solitary confinement. Thank you for having me here. Thank you.
Thank you for speaking today, and I would ask that you speak with board staff further so that they can follow up on Mr. Marrero's correspondence. Thank you. Jennifer Parrish. Good morning.
Good morning. My name is Jennifer Parrish. I'm with the Urban Justice Center Mental Health Project, the Halt Solitary Campaign, and the Jails Action Coalition. I support your initiating rulemaking, but more importantly, I ask that you consider the rules proposed by members of the Halt Solitary Campaign and the Jails Action Coalition. Compared to what has been put forth for restrictive rulemaking, they represent a paradigm shift away from punishment, which is proven to be highly ineffective. Put simply, punishment doesn't work. That doesn't mean that there doesn't need to be separation for safety and that safety isn't essential, but punitive response that the department has relied on is not making the jails safer, and it harms people in the process. We propose entirely eliminating units that reduce the amount of out-of-cell time provided while allowing for individual lock-in to de-escalate behavior when needed, but closely regulated and with time limits. These units must be service-rich environments where non-DOC staff provide interventions that address the underlying causes of harmful behavior. Units that limit out-of-cell time create conflict between incarcerated people and staff. People in these units are generally not afforded all the lockout time they're entitled to, and as a result, that's been documented by the board and the DOC. This is true of ESH and the RHU, where Laylene Polanco died, and the failure to provide out-of-cell time creates conflict on the unit and endangers the health of people placed here. We know from the most recent Nunez Monitors report that correction staff fuel violence, instigating it rather than de-escalating tensions. On a restrictive unit, that response is all the more likely when people are viewed as being there to be punished. Rather than addressing various forms of restriction with some additional limits and some additional due process, we ask that you require bold change of this broken system. Let's create the kind of transformation that City Hall and DOC purport to support but have failed to initiate. And I just want to make a comment about separation status variance. You know, it's not on the agenda today, but it really should be. The department continues to use it, yet another person was placed there last week. The department has not designed separation status to be the least restrictive method for accomplishing the goal of recovering dangerous contraband. Instead, they've created unconscionable conditions designed to compel any incarcerated person to submit to the department's will. That is the very definition of torture, and the board must not condone it. How can this board permit the department to continue isolating incarcerated individuals in conditions that fall far below what the board has determined to be the minimum standards for incarceration? How can this board tolerate the department's continued use of this status when it results in people missing court appearances, the very reason that they're incarcerated in the first place? And this is no longer speculation by advocates. At the last meeting, you reported that 3 people had already missed court dates because of this practice. And consider who's being placed in this most extreme form of isolation, beyond anything that's permitted in any other lockdown. Young adults are placed in this status. Despite the rule that you have that they can't be in punitive segregation, more than half of the people in these units are young adults. And people with mental health concerns are placed in this status, despite your rule that exempt people with serious mental disabilities from punitive segregation. At the last meeting, the board reported that half of the people placed in the unit were receiving mental health treatment, and 1 person missed his medication for 2 days. That should be of grave concern to you. The variance that the department requested does not contain any specific provisions regarding people who are housed on mental observation units or PACE units. There are no requirements about the involvement of mental health other than conducting daily rounds. 1/3 of the people are there because they refuse to be scanned. And has been pointed out at these meetings, there's no reason that there are reasons other than concealing contraband that might make a person refuse a scan. We don't know anything about the extent of these individuals' mental health needs, but we do know that 1 person was placed there twice. It's certainly possible that people who refuse the scans will wind up in this status again and again because there are no provisions for allowing the investigation of the reasons for the person's refusal and the involvement of health staff in this process. The department and the board have thrown out all they know about the harmful effects of isolation on young people and those with disabilities. At this point, instead of postponing addressing this issue until the next meeting, the board should really be issuing a notice of violation to the department for violating multiple minimum standards. Thank you.
Thank you. Harvey Murphy. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. My name is Harvey Murphy. I'm a community organizer at Just Leadership USA. I represent the Jail Action Coalition and Halt Solitary. I am a solitary survivor. I sat in solitary confinement for 120 days. In them 120 days, I was treated like an animal. I was taunted by COs. I was sprayed with mace. I was denied my visits. They actually put me on a loaf. At the time when I went into solitary confinement, I was weighing 192 pounds. When I got out of solitary confinement, I weighed 123 pounds. I don't understand. I don't know if you guys know what the loaf is. The loaf is cabbage, bread, and everything packed in together, and they slide it under your cell. Right now, I got a bad throat infection right now. I'm really not supposed to be up here, but this is a very, very solid issue that I'm standing on. We have to look at people as human beings. I am a human being. I'm not no animal. I was one of them kids that was chained to the desk. How did I feel when I was chained to the desk? I felt like an animal. We don't treat people like animal. I am not an animal. I'm a highly respected member for my community. I'm a highly respected member of my church. I sit up here and I just shake my head because honestly, it's people still right now in solitary confinement that's dealing with the torment that I had to deal with. And honestly, they coming back to our community. They coming back to our community because you want to know something? I came back to my community, and I'm fighting back for my community. I'm fighting back for the individuals that can't speak up for themselves. I just want to ask you guys, just please look inside dig deep inside and understand that we are human beings. I am a human being, not an animal, y'all. I just want to say thank you. I appreciate you guys' time.
Thank you very much. Scott Paltrowitz.
Thank you for the time, and thank you for initiating rulemaking today. I'm urging you to include in your rulemaking the proposed rule submitted by the Jails Action Coalition and the Halt Solitary Confinement campaign. Our community rule is what is actually needed to meaningfully and effectively abolish solitary confinement and to meaningfully and effectively promote real safety. And it would do it through 5 key mechanisms. Jennifer Parrish mentioned some of them. Let me just highlight a few. Number 1, the board's minimum standards for how people should be treated should apply to all people. There is no reason that there should be differences for different people in different units. People should have access to 14 hours out of cell per day at a minimum. Number 2, there should be specific and detailed minimum standards for individual lock-ins and lockdowns that put time limits that are measured in minutes and hours, not in days and beyond. Number 3, punitive segregation has to end, and any alternative units have to actually be about safety, not about isolation and torture. There are examples right in the city with the CAPS program, around the state with the Merle Cooper program as an example, in other jails around the country, such as the RSVP program in San Francisco, that show isolation doesn't work to reduce safety. More human engagement, more programs, more support is what actually works to bring about greater safety, both inside of jails and outside of our communities. I see the time is ticking, so I'm going to skip ahead to just say solitary must be abolished in New York City, and it must be abolished because it is torture. I think I'm just pausing for a second because the word torture is bandied about, and solitary, I think because advocates and community members have done an amazing job of showing that this is torture, but this is torture, right? The city cannot be carrying out torture, and the board cannot be countenancing torture. You have the power to end it, and you must. Layleen Polanco died. Khalif Browder died. Bradley Ballard died. Jason Echeverria died. How many more people have to lose their lives and their minds before this board will actually do what is right, not what is politically feasible or expedient, just do what is right? The board has known for years that in the city itself, people in solitary are nearly 7 times more likely to commit self-harm and more than 6 times more likely to commit potentially fatal self-harm. You know that this is causing death in addition to devastation, and yet you are continuing to allow it to happen. Solitary must also be abolished because it causes violence. It doesn't reduce violence. It makes jails less safe. It makes our communities less safe, and you are responsible as the board for allowing not only this torture, but for violence to be continuing inside of jails and in our communities. Solitary, like other forms of torture, and like the incarceration system as a whole, is not, in fact, was never designed or carried out to increase safety or reduce violence. It has always been another tool of repression and destruction of the human spirit. And we know, particularly for Black and Latinx, Native people, queer, transgender, and gender nonconforming people. We know it doesn't work to deal with safety. That's not why it was done. That's not why it's being carried out. But if we look at the purported justification of safety, it is the absolute opposite of what would be needed for safety. Renowned mental health jail administrator and expert on violence, Dr. James Gilligan, has written, quote, "Far from preventing violence, punishment is the most powerful stimulus to violent behavior that we have yet discovered." We know, again, we are killing people, we are destroying people's minds, and we are creating violence. It is time for this to stop. In the current moment we are in, and in light of the ongoing death and destruction and violence that is happening, the board must go beyond placing some time limits with loopholes on one form of solitary, while sanctioning all other forms with nothing but reporting requirements and additional procedures. This board has the power to end this torture, and I urge you to act. Thank you.
Thank you. Francis Gatellis. Winston Quinn.
Good morning. This is actually going
Good
to
morning.
dovetail pretty well with those previous comments. I haven't had a chance to really look at these rules, but I was perusing the department's directives on a rainy night, as one does, and I wanted to read a specific part. So this is the directive on the Safe House, Clean House program. This was effective date is April 24th of '03, so it's a little old. But so this program, I guess, was supposed to incentivize good behavior. Part of it is, keeping your house clean, but part of it is also keeping your house safe. And so if a housing unit doesn't have any of the following infractions, a grade 1 assault or a grade 1 infraction for fighting or contraband or disrespect of staff, they're entitled to a certain reward. Now, the reward, as written, now remember this is from 2003, as written, this reward is, on a quarterly basis, they're going to draw, and the winner has an access to a color television and VCR to view a movie. Now, that seems a little dated to me. The reason I bring this up is because this is one of the few examples of positive reinforcement I think that the department has in its directives, and I've heard several board members here describe punitive segregation as a tool, as a necessary tool for helping to modify behavior. I think there are other tools out there. I think they're rusty. They haven't been looked at since 2003. I mean, I don't even know if you can find a VCR anymore. So I would suggest maybe as possible help for any board member who's deciding whether or not it's possible to use this tool less. I think it is possible. There are other tools out there. I think you just have to sharpen them and give them another look. My other comment is I've given this comment before, but looking at the due process section, I didn't see mention of any more specifics about interpreters. I've gone down before for trial board meetings. Usually when an interpreter is called for, it's usually just asking another CO if they speak Spanish. I think there are conflict of interests there. Words that are similar. I think I don't speak Spanish, but I've been told that the word for spit and assault are very similar. And so easy mistranslations are done, I think, at the cost of the inmates who are before the trial board. So I think something along those lines would be probably prudent. But I'll save the rest of my comments for later. Thank you.
Thank you. Alex Abel. Good morning.
Hello, good morning. I'm Alex Abel. I'm with the Urban Justice Center's Mental Health Project and also a member of the Jails Action Coalition. My comments actually dovetail nicely with the previous gentleman's comments too. Excuse me, I have a little bit of a cold. I wanted to come up and emphasize how important I think it is that other tools be added to the toolbox, so to speak, of the Department of Corrections, because I think that as long as the culture doesn't change about how we're dealing with violence, then basically we're going to see the same results and the same tools, just in different forms. And so I think that the board should do whatever it can to support other options, other positive reinforcements to stop violence, because I think, so for example, the gentleman earlier mentioned NYC. And so I go into the jails and I interview people who are receiving mental health services. So I get to see a lot of the different areas within the jail. And the area that he was referring to, that the letter was referring to, is basically solitary in the same form. the essence is exactly the same. And so I think if we get hung up on specific definitions of what solitary confinement is, then the Department of Corrections is going to continue to use the same hammer, basically, just in a different form. And I think the whole point of solitary, the reason why it's damaging is it's sensory deprivation. And so the housing units at NIC, although you have people who can kind of see each other, and I'm talking about the second and third floor specifically from what I've seen, you can see people, but there's bars up everywhere, and there's this small hallway that lets in almost no light, and it's a dismal, like awful place. And so that's not listed. I didn't really see that included in the rulemaking, but I feel like unless there's pressure to actually create new rules, a new way of doing things, then we're just going to keep on seeing sensory deprivation in different ways, such as the shackles. And the problem with that, of course, is, besides it being inhumane, that no one loses their humanity, no matter what they've done. They still remain a human being, or what they've been accused of doing. They still remain a human being. Violence prevention is, from my understanding of it, is all about getting people to think and to reason. And what sensory deprivation does is shortcut the entire part of their brain that is able to reason. And so that's why it doesn't work, and that's why you need other ways of approaching violence instead of putting people into survival mode, basically, which is what leads to violence. Thank you.
Thank you. Victoria Phillips. Good morning.
Good morning. My name is Minister Dr. Victoria Phillips. Everyone knows me as Ms. V, and I also work with Alex at the Mental Health Project Urban Justice Center, and I'm also a member of the Jails Action Coalition. Now, I just saw y'all last week. I spoke to y'all 3 times, but today I'm standing before you with the Nunez report, 302 pages of reasons why you should eliminate solitary confinement. And I'm going to be very clear. For the last 8 years, I've testified before the Board of Correction. Many of you wasn't even a part of it when I started testifying my truth of what I directly witnessed on Rikers Island. And over the years, I've continued to testify for individuals, whether it was uniformed staff or incarcerated individuals, giving me that direct experience and truth and knowing that I was going to come to you and deliver the message. Now, before I even get fully started, I want to just say the young man from GMAC spoke and he mentioned David Marrero. So let it be clear that if any retaliation is brought to David because he took a chance today to speak directly, have his name directly put on public record about having the experiences that he experienced in NIC, all of y'all are going to be held responsible, and I will organize around all of y'all communities because it is now your direct duty to keep that man safe. Do y'all understand me? Okay, so Nunez report once again verified everything I have ever come before this board and testified on why solitary should not continue, because we cannot trust DOC's word. We cannot trust what they write in their paperwork. Commissioner Brand always come up here and say how DOC is changing, yet the 8th report of Nunez still says, the department has not shown itself capable of devising and implementing effective strategies to fully institutionalize the use of force reforms required by the consent judgment. It also says, staff utilizing unsafe and ineffective techniques, including head strikes, painful escort holds, and heavy-handed takedowns. Staff dehumanizing inmates and exaggerating the uses of force via their language, tone, and nonverbal communications. When you start thinking about your rulemaking and you start thinking about putting people in solitary for 60 days based on the use of a force against an officer, you have to understand a lot of times the officer's word cannot be true. A lot of times the officers who remain silent do just as much injustice as the officers who actually committed the corrupt actions, because they too allow certain violations to occur by not even coming forward. And when you're sitting here thinking about making rulemaking, you have to take all of that into effect. Last week, I directly told you, you cannot say about separation status, you cannot say it's all for the safety of DOC when you have the Nunez report telling you DOC instigates many of those situations that have people land in those type of units. And you all will be held accountable. You have several doctors on your board. You all have magnificent titles and expertise. Utilize it. Or I promise you, this is the last warning you get. I will show up in your communities and organize, die hard for my people behind the walls. Have a blessed day.
Thank you. Marvin Mayfield. Good morning.
Good morning. There's a lot to get in 3 minutes, so let me get started. Some time ago, I suffered from depression. As a result of self-medicating, I ended up incarcerated in jail in Rikers Island. When I got there, I was despondent and unresponsive. I didn't talk. I didn't speak to anyone because of my depression status. As a result of that, I was placed in what they call the MO, the Mental Observation Unit. At that point in time, it was the same thing as solitary confinement. I was there by myself for the first 7 days, and I was reevaluated. Still despondent. I ended up, to make a long story short, I ended up spending 45 days in that particular position. I was prescribed psychotropic medications, which I didn't take. I chose not to take them, and I stayed there for another 45 days. For a total of 90 days during some of the worst summer months, being incarcerated continuously. There was no 1 hour recreation. There was no getting out of my cell. The only time I ever got out was when they reevaluated me for the doctors, which was not often. Make no mistake about it, no matter what you call it, right? I mean, solitary confinement, restrictive housing, special housing, enhanced supervision. Solitary confinement is torture. The people who are unfortunate enough to find themselves in that position are usually the people who are least able and likely to be able to fend for themselves. I'm standing here before you with firsthand knowledge of this to tell you that when I walked into those cells, especially in the mental observation unit cells, they were filthy. They were disgusting. There was nothing in there. They were strip cells, basically. The only thing, there was a hole in the wall for a toilet. There were feces and garbage all over the walls. These are conditions that no one should have to suffer, especially on a continuous 24-hour basis. I'm speaking from firsthand knowledge, and I also think that we need to remove the element of discretion from correction officers who decide that, okay, well, today you're not going to get rec. Today you're not going to get an hour. Today you're not going to get fed. You're not going to get a visit. And that's basically because this a CO, correction officer at that point in time, was fed up or didn't like you, or for whatever the case was. That should be eliminated. They should not have the discretion to do that. There are examples of alternatives to segregation, such as the Merle Cooper program that was run by the state, where people who are typically segregated are in a special unit where they're all together and they're supervised, and it works. It's worked from 1977 to 2013 until it was disbanded because of funding. I'm asking you here today to have compassion for those people who cannot fend for themselves. Solitary confinement by any other name is still torture. And I'm asking you to open your hearts and be compassionate about those who need your help the most. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Vidal Guzman. Good morning.
Good morning. My name is Vidal Guzman. I want to start this up with a quote. The government of the people, by the people, for the people. Abraham Lincoln said that when he believed that this government will be created by the people. But we're here today to talk about human rights. People who, as people say, just don't have the knowledge or the abilities to defend themselves. We are in a place in society as we are shaping our ideas, this is the point that we talk about something crucial. Human beings being detained, human beings not having the power to defend themselves, human beings not being able to use their voices. As I talk, I'm a person who was in solitary confinement for 2.5 years. I did 7 years or incarcerated at 16, 17, and also 19 till I was 24. I've been in solitary confinement for 2.5 years, 2.5 years of stories that I get to tell you, 2.5 years of seeing people take their life, 2.5 years seeing someone actually come into solitary confinement as a regular person and leave out not a regular person. We are in a crucial moment, and I'm going to say this again. We can shape the image of what it means to end solitary confinement, and we have the blueprint to end solitary confinement that the Jails Action Coalition has created in HALT's Act. We are here to shape up of what exactly it means, the government by the people, for the people. What does that actually mean? Do we go home and forget what people said? Do we go home and forget the stories that people have experienced and been traumatized and been caged in? Or do we actually put actions behind our words? This is never going to be easy. This is never going to be easy when we talked about ending solitary confinement. But what will we leave our mark in history, society, when we leave out these positions? As account for yourself. We come doing whatever we want to do in the world, but how do we leave this world? It comes to us. Today, we can take a bold moment and say it's time to end solitary confinement. Through our stories, through our image, through our vision, it's time for us as a city, it's time for us as people, it's time for us as individuals, it's time for us as individuals who have never experienced solitary confinement to really say as a whole, stop. And let's end it. No more. How many people do we have to lose? Because they're just not a name. Those are humans. And human detained still deserve human rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Brandon Holmes. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm testifying today on behalf of Just Leadership USA and specifically the Close Rikers campaign. We are also partners and members with the Jails Action Coalition. Recently, criminal justice advocates across the city counted a substantial victory 2 weeks ago when City Council voted to shrink the system by 75% and improve conditions for anyone still detained in city jails. But the system and the population have been shrinking for years, and it has been your responsibility to begin conditions improvement and culture transformation during that time. Our leaders who have lived the hell of Rikers and other cities' jails, and many other advocates in this room, are very aware that new buildings will not be sufficient to achieve the massive culture change that is necessary and urgently needed in New York City jails, nor will they come soon enough to save tens of thousands more people from the abuse at the hands of the Department of Corrections. This board's role as a strong and independent oversight body is and will be essential to achieve actual transformation and accountability in the coming years. It will require each of you to have the courage to break old patterns because those patterns have resulted in countless trauma, injury, the loss of lives at the hands of DOC for decades. We just got an 8th report. Not a 3rd report or a 4th report, the 8th report that is able to cite that there has been a 98% increase in use of force since 2016. Today, I want to ask the board on the record to describe how you are planning to address the findings of this 8th report from the Nunez Independent Monitor. Some of the keynotes from this report, on page 7, the department has not shown itself capable of devising and implementing effective strategies to fully institutionalize the use of force reforms required by the consent judgment. That is your role. On page 10, The department remains in non-compliance with 4 of the most consequential provisions of the consent judgment. 1, implementation of the use of force policy. 2, timely and quality investigations. 3, meaningful and adequate discipline. And 4, reducing violence among young people. That is your role. On page 11, the department has not been able to keep pace with timely investigation of staff misconduct, and there is a backlog of approximately 6,815 investigations. That is your role. The last point is especially important because Commissioner Brand has stated that this is not the same department that it was 5 years ago. On page 22, the report states that compared to use of force when the consent judgment first went into effect, which was concerning enough on its own, the average use of force rate, again, was at a 98% increase since 2016. What will the board do about the department's continued and documented failures that cause harm to people in their custody and the families that welcome them home? 3 specific questions that I'd like to ask of the board. 1, the department was required to set up an early warning system to identify as soon as possible staff members whose conduct warrants corrective action. What can the board suggest to address the obvious need shown by the high and growing number of use of force incidents to enroll more staff in a program like EISS? Second, how will the board address this backlog of 6,815 investigations of staff misconduct? And last, because of the federal monitor, the Department of Corrections is required to provide a report listing every pending disciplinary case and the officers involved. Will the Board of Corrections request this report and provide a summary to the public identifying the officers with more than 3 pending disciplinary cases? In closing, I want to ask the board, as someone who is deeply impacted by the history of Rikers Island, born with my relatives, my cousins, uncles, aunts in Rikers Island. From the day I was born to today, still having a cousin in a federal facility, still having 2 aunts in a state facility. In closing, I want to ask this board, as you consider changes to restrictive housing rules, is this a department that you really believe can and will exercise good judgment to determine if someone should be kept in isolation, knowing that deadly consequences will come from doing that?
Thank you very much. And thank you all for your comments today. That I believe concludes the public comment period. And I would like to say thank you for the comments on the recent report by the independent monitor. I would like to note that the report will be on the November agenda for the board during our November meeting. And with the conclusion of the public comment period, we will move to a board vote on the restrictive housing proposed rules. Will a board member move to propose the restrictive housing rule that was published on the board's website and distributed to interested parties on Tuesday, October 29th? Second. I'll open the floor for discussion.
I agree with the speakers today that the context for our rule is the 8th report of the Nunez Monitor. I'll come back to that in a second. I share with Chair Sherman a tremendous debt to the board staff for the preparation of this report. The attempt was to come up with a comprehensive critique of overuse of solitary confinement and and a way to make sure that it was fair in terms of due process, and to make sure that anybody who was in any kind of restrictive housing, whether a solitary confinement or administrative housing or a physically restrictive housing, that was not an indeterminate or endless sentence, that there's a way out of everything. And to some extent we succeeded, and to some extent we need your help in improving the rule over the next period. There are elements which need to be in this rule, which I am optimistic will be. You know, we need to have make sure that there's adequate training. We need to make sure that of the correctional staff, and we need the money and the support for that. We need to make sure that there is adequate staffing for units where restrictions take place. We need to have adequate reporting and not just be given handwritten, illegible paper documents, but have reports which the department needs to manage its own facilities. And these are not reports for the board to write for them. This is data that's structured in reports that are meaningful with quality, so that we can move forward. I think that I would commend to everybody here, and this is obviously one of the most informed audiences in New York, you know, the board statement of basis and purpose for this rule, because it describes a history that resulted in us getting to this point. And it's not a happy history, but it is a history of recognition and a history of attempted change, some successes, some failures, and a roadmap to where we have to go further. I do particularly ask City Hall to listen to the modern world, to listen to the critique of solitary confinement, and to direct its Department of Correction to enter into the 21st century. The Nunez report describes barbarisms which need to be addressed, and to date the department has said absolutely nothing about this. And it's a fundamental, as it states in the first point, it's a fundamental failure to manage the inmate population. This includes staff precipitated force, in which staff's approach to a situation creates or exacerbates the need to use force. More specifically, staff are often hyper-confrontational and respond to incidents in a manner that is hasty, hurried, thoughtless, reckless, careless, or in disregard of consequences. So, this board represents a wide range of experiences relative to jails, and I am proud to be on it. And I think there is a tremendous concern about the adverse consequences of solitary confinement on this on this board. And over the next several months, with your help, and most importantly, not most importantly, but substantially, a recognition by the city administration that they have to recognize that there are very serious problems with the way the department has been addressing issues of violence, and to respond to that, and to have that reflected in their support of rules which go towards limiting the solitary confinement, restrictive housing in the city's jails. Thank you. And that's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you.
I will add, having served on the committee that has gotten us to this place, I just want to add that I'm glad we're here. I'm grateful that we're here at this particular time, that we are entering into the capital process. For me, this is a starting place. Your input, your comments are critical to get us to where we need to be. I do not see what has been presented thus far and what is going into CAPA as a done deal. There's more work to be done, and your input is critical to that process, so thank you.
Thank you.
I I agree with Jennifer. I think this is a starting point. You know, a number of people got up and said, we are at a historic point in our city, and truly we are. And we can't stop because we got a city council vote and the mayor's agreement to close Rikers. We have to continue to work to reform the system so that New York is really leading on criminal justice reform. And punitive seg, solitary confinement, separation, housing, whatever you want to call it, is that next frontier. And we need to be bold, and we need to change it. And so this is not the end, this is the beginning, and your voice matters. Keep speaking up, keep showing out, and keep supporting the work that we need to do moving forward. Now is the time for us to do it.
Thank you.
I agree with what was just said. That's what I was going to say.
Thank you.
I also echo what my colleagues are saying. I think we're now at the verge of a process that's going to be a public process, which sets forth the ability for all stakeholders, advocates, community organizers, correction officials, unions, board members, everyone to participate in this process. And as Jennifer indicated, this is actually the beginning. And I'm committed to working with all of you to make sure that we come up with a robust policy by the end of this process.
Thank you. With that, we'll move to a vote, whether to propose the rules and move into the CAPA process.
So
Mr.
moved.
Mr. Regan? Yes. Dr. Safier?
Oh, did you move it? You seconded?
Yes.
Yes.
We had a second.
Yes.
I vote yes. By unanimous vote, we've moved the rules into the CAPA process. And that concludes the public portion of our agenda today. I would like to, at this point, I'd like to move that the board move into a brief executive session to provide a briefing to the board on the search for a new executive director for the board to date. Do I have a second?
Second.
And a vote? All
Yes.
members in favor? Okay.
Yes.
We will move into a brief executive session.